Let's talk about RDLs, Romanian deadlifts. Romanian deadlifts are a type of deadlift where you don't bring the bar all the way to the ground. You essentially keep the muscles under tension throughout the entire range of motion. It starts from the top, and then you push your hips back and then stop before the weight meets the floor. And there's a couple of different variations of the exercise depending on what muscle group you want to focus on. For a regular RDL, you're generally going to bend your knees a little bit to allow your hips to go back nice and far. But it's not a squat. You're not trying to bring your knees towards your toes. Your knees bend in order to push your hips back further. Then there's the stiff leg deadlift, which is a variation of the RDL where you keep your knees straight. And with the stiff leg deadlift, that is going to have less hip hinge and more emphasis on the hamstrings because you're going to get a much deeper stretch in your hamstrings than in your glutes. And then for people who have a lot of flexibility to bring like their either their glutes or their hamstrings or both into a big range of motion, if they were to go to the point where their muscles could stretch out all the way and the weight would hit the floor, the solution for that would be to do the exercise from an elevated surface, which would make it a deficit deadlift or a deficit RDL. So from there, you're able to do the exercise and keep your muscles under tension the whole time without the weight touching the floor or resting on the floor. So the difference looks like this. So with the RDL, usually you're gonna start with the bar like just resting on the rack. Unless you have weights on it, you can also rest it on the floor. But it's kind of set up like a conventional deadlift. Your feet are gonna be right underneath your hips here, and your hands are gonna be wider than your hips. So this is a regular RDL. I push my hips back, I let my knees bend so that I can get as deep of a hip hinge as I can, and then I'm gonna come back up. A lot of times, that means that the bar is gonna stop like mid-shin. But you go back as far as your flexibility allows. And now with a stiff leg deadlift, which puts more emphasis on my hamstrings and less on my glutes, I'm gonna keep my knees from bending as much. They might bend a little bit, but I'm gonna focus on keeping them straight. And that means I can't go down quite as far, but I'm going until I feel my hamstrings fully stretched, and then I come back to the top. So this is a great exercise for training your hamstrings. And then for the deficit, usually you're gonna be standing on a platform, or you can stand on a plate. I'll do a plate. Okay, so the reason why we have the weight here, or the elevated surface, is that if I were to go as far back as my hips allow me to, trying to do a Romanian deadlift with weights on the bar, the weights would hit the floor. You see? Because I have the flexibility for that. And I don't want the weight to hit the floor because I want to keep my muscles under tension the whole time. And so I'm going to use a little bit of a higher platform. And now the weight doesn't hit the floor. And I can get my glutes as stretched as they need to be. The reason why we like to do deficit RDLs, you want to for muscle building, you want to stretch your muscles out as far as your mobility allows. You want to get them fully elongated while staying under tension using the weight. So if you're doing an RDL, but like the weight is hitting the floor, then you're losing tension at the point where the glutes are most elongated. And that's where we need them to be under tension in order to maximize growth, because you get a lot more microscopic muscle tears in your muscles when they're elongated and they're tight versus when they're contracted. So that's why we want to keep the muscles under tension, right, when they're most elongated. The same thing is like, when you're doing bicep curls, if you just if the weight stopped at the bottom, right, you want, at the bottom of the bicep curls when we want the most tension. We want to keep tension there on the biceps in order to maximize growth. It's the same thing. A lot of times people mistake RDLs as a down and up movement because that's kind of what the weight is doing, but you need to think of it more as a back and forth movement. Your hips go back. And one thing to keep in mind with all three of these variations is your chest stops moving, your shoulders stop moving when your hips stop moving. So your hips go back and then you come back forward, right? Don't keep lowering the weight towards the floor after your hips stop moving, because that's a great way to hurt your back. You want to keep your back in alignment and tight. You want to keep your abdominals engaged and your lats engaged. Squeeze your armpits, externally rotate your shoulders, and that's going to protect your back as your hips go back. But don't think about the weight going up and down. Think about your hips going back and forth. The back and forth tip is good. Yeah, it's made a big difference for my clients, because what happens, like what a lot of people end up doing is their hips go back and then they keep lowering the weight down. And that's all back movement there. That's all back, right? We want the hips to support the movement. So the hips go back. As soon as the hips stop, the chest stops. Hips go back, and then we bring them forward. So there you go. 3 variations of the RDL.